we can go ahead. Fabulous. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for today's Lunch and Learn panel discussion on accessible design in the built environment, with a special focus on historic structures and scenic landmarks. If you're seeking AIA credit for this course and have not yet shared your AIA number with our programs manager, Michelle Arbalou, please put it in the chat so that Michelle can record it. During today's program, you can also ask questions in the chat, and we can address them during the question time at the end of this panel. Today's discussion will be recorded and posted to our YouTube channel for free viewing. You may also watch all of our previous preservation school classes, virtual tours, and conference panels on our YouTube channel. My name is Lucy Levine, and I am the Preservation Advocacy and Community Outreach Manager at the Historic Districts Council. HDC is the citywide advocate for New York's historic neighborhoods. We collaborate with and support more than 500 community partners to help preserve the places that matter to them. As part of that advocacy, HDC reviews all public applications presented to the Landmarks Preservation Commission. That's more than 300 applications in 2024 alone, including numerous proposals each year, which seek to make buildings, sites, and parks accessible. Accessibility and universal design are vital to our work, and we hope today's panel will help promote accessible solutions for designated places while offering an opportunity to hear from practitioners working through accessible solutions for historic structures, adaptive reuse projects, and new construction within historic districts. Today's panelists are doing exactly that, and I am thrilled to hand the discussion over to HDC board member and today's moderator, Corey Spitzer, who will introduce our panelists. Corey?
Thanks, Lucy. So welcome, everyone. We're really happy to have you here. Today, we have 3 panelists with us that are involved with accessibility in different ways. So first up is Danise Levine, and she will give us a whole schooling on universal design. Irina Verona, who's an architect, also an architect. And then Giulietta Fiore, who is working with HHT, Historic House Trust. So I'm going to start with that, but first we are going to define what we are going to be talking about. So Irina,
okay.
To you.
Okay, I will take it from here. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. So I'm going to just launch right into some definitions, and then we're going to introduce ourselves more fully in a little bit. I have 5 words that I want to define for our panel today. And just before I start, I wanted to note that language is very nuanced in relation to accessibility and disability, and we don't always get the language right. And there's also a lot of difference. You might hear different definitions, different interpretations. So I think it's important to just define and be clear about what we mean, and also give each other grace. So these are our working definitions at, by our, I mean at Verona Carpenter Architects, and I'm going to start with accessibility. So accessibility is more than access, which is traditionally understood as I can get in, I can move around. And it's more than inclusion, which is inviting somebody into your own world. We define an accessible place as a place that can be meaningfully occupied and enjoyed by its occupants. So including by disabled occupants, and where you can be yourself. Next word is disabled. I'm going to use here a definition by autistic scholar Nick Walker, who has a very good definition of what we call the social model of disability, which we'd like to propose. So in the social model, disabled is understood as the opposite of enabled. Society is set up to meet the needs of people with a specific set of traits, needs, and abilities. Those privileged people are abled or enabled. And when a person is disabled, we mean that society isn't properly set up to enable their participation. Next term is neurodivergence. And this word was coined by Kassiana Asamasu in 2000. And she defined it as, quote, any significant divergence from dominant cultural forms of neurocognitive functioning, end of quote. So it's a very broad, inclusive term that encompasses autism, ADHD, dyslexia, PTSD, Tourette's, and other identities. And depending on which studies you refer to, between 15 and 20% of our population is neurodivergent. disability overlaps with neurodivergent. So some neurodivergent people are disabled. For instance, autistic people can be disabled because the world is set up in a way that precludes their societal participation. But not all neurodivergent people will identify as disabled. Neurotypical is the opposite of neurodivergent, and this does not mean normal. It means that the world functions well for you as it is arranged. So I'd like to end on with a term that's not really maybe expected, but it's sensory integration. And it's a term that refers to the neurological process that organizes sensations from one's body and from the environment and makes it possible to use the body effectively in the environment. So the way that you feel in a space is directly related to how your brain reacts to the information that is delivered by the space through your senses. And this is different for everyone. So due to their sensory processing, many neurodivergent people face very real challenges navigating environments and systems that are largely designed by and for neurotypical people. So in terms of accessibility, it's important to consider not just physical barriers, but also sensory barriers. So now I'm going to pass it over to Danise.
So I'm going to talk about inclusivity and universal design, and a lot of times those are used interchangeably. We typically talk about universal design. It basically has a meaning. But when I typically talk to people about universal design, I usually start by talking about what universal design is not. And I do that because many people think that accessibility and universal design are the same thing, but universal design is not accessibility, and the terms are not interchangeable. And I think that's really important that we recognize the difference. So I want to make the following points that I'm sure a lot of you probably already understand, but I think it's important for me to say it so that as we move along in the discussion, you can make that sort of difference between one and the other. So the first point I want to make is that accessibility is when you specifically are designing for people with disabilities to eliminate any barriers that might limit their usability of their environment, but that can also extend to product design. Secondly, accessibility is legally mandated by codes. And the one that you guys are probably most familiar with is the ADA, which requires compliance with minimum codes and standards. And although codes and standards are certainly necessary, there are limitations to accessibility in that most of the requirements are focused on people with mobility impairments, particularly people who use wheelchairs. And as we all know, not all people who have a disability use a wheelchair. So it's mostly focused on one small portion of the population. Another thing about accessibility is that because codes are only focused on functional issues and accessibility requirements are minimum requirements, they really don't take good design and aesthetics into consideration. And what I mean by that is that even if a building is built strictly to code, it doesn't guarantee that the building will be usable by people that will use it. So, for example, if you have a public building with stairs at the main entrance and there's an accessible ramp installed at the back or side entrance, it'll be a major inconvenience for anyone who is unable to navigate stairs. So whether they use a wheelchair or not, I think a situation like that sends a really terrible message. So essentially, this design doesn't provide an equal experience for everybody and creates separation between people who are able-bodied and people with disabilities. So based on all of this, we know that accessibility just isn't good enough. And as designers, we really need to do better. So instead of designing to accommodate a small portion of the population, the concept of universal design was born. So in the simplest of terms, to describe universal design, it's a concept that integrates and includes people with disabilities along with everybody else. So, what does that really mean? It means that universal design makes life easier, healthier, and friendlier for all people, regardless of their physical, functional, or sensory abilities. So whether you're young or old, disabled, or able-bodied, tall or short, it really makes no difference.
Great. Thank you, Denise. So I'm going to ask each of our panelists to quickly introduce themselves by asking, how are you engaged in the accessibility of historic structures, districts, and landscapes? And I'm going to start with Giulietta.
Hello, everybody. My name is Giulietta. I'm Acting Director of the Historic House Trust of New York City. We are a public-private partnership with the New York City Department of Parks and Recreation, and we help steward and preserve 23 historic houses that operate as museums on public parkland citywide across all 5 boroughs. A lot of our responsibility is to not only make sure that the historic houses under our care are in good condition for use by community partners, but also that as public spaces, they are available for use by the broadest possible audience, and that we continue to evolve these spaces as the needs of the city change, because they always do change. This is an evolving city. So we're very focused on working with our nonprofit partners to both improve physically and also programmatically accessibility to the historic houses kind of under our care. And we're really looking forward to chatting more about this in this panel.
Fantastic. Irina?
Yes. So I'm Irina Verona. Very excited to be here with you all. I'm a principal at Verona Carpenter Architects. We're based on the Lower East Side in New York City, and we are engaged in a variety of project types and scales, including historic, and you will see an example in a little bit, but also urban, so kind of the range in between. And we're currently working, for instance, on a project called the neurodiverse city, which seeks to make public space more inclusive for all New Yorkers, including for those who are neurodivergent. A thread that runs through all of our work is designing for the diversity of bodies and minds that define our world. So we use design and the design process to dismantle some of the barriers to belonging, and including a big barrier, which is limited ideas about what it means to have worth and to be worth making space for. We think of our approach as inclusion beyond access. So this results often in spaces with more affordances. So that means, for instance, more offerings for more people, more options for ways of occupying, including a range of sensory environments. And finally, we believe that the design process itself is a really big part of inclusive design. So we seek out and amplify disabled and neurodivergent voices as part of our design process. Thank you.
Great. And Danise?
Hi, I'm Danise Levine. I am a registered architect, and I work at the Idea Center in Buffalo. It stands for Inclusive Design and Environmental Access. And we have the only federally funded center on universal design in the country. And we've had it for 25 years. So like I said, I'm a registered architect. I have expertise in accessibility and universal design. And over my 28 years of architectural practice, I've help many organizations implement universal design strategies into their projects. And I don't do a lot of historic buildings, but I do have 2 projects that I have been working on. The first historic project I worked on was for the Children's Museum of Pittsburgh. And that's a project that I will be showing you guys in a little while. And the current project that I'm working on is the Smithsonian Castle at the National Mall in Washington, D.C., which is currently getting a big overhaul and is under construction. And it's expected to be completed in 2028. And both of these projects were designed to be fully inclusive.
Excellent. Thank you, everyone. So I'm going to give each of our panelists here a moment to describe how you include inclusivity in existing and historic buildings. I'm going to share my screen to give us some visuals, because we all know architecture is better served that way. And I am going to accidentally put it all in the wrong order. So Irina, you're going to be first up.
Okay, I'm ready when you share.
As soon as great, thank you. All right.
Great. So I'm going to share with you a project that we just completed at Princeton. It's the Princeton University Prospect House, which is really a hospitality center that holds events pretty much 24/7, lots of meetings, dinners. It has 3 commercial kitchens. So it's a really, really, really robust infrastructure component. So our work for this renovation, which was exterior and interior, was to upgrade the infrastructure, some really kind of behind the scenes and behind the walls upgrades of every single service that you can imagine. But what I want to focus on for today is the kind of the accessibility and inclusion component, which was a really big part of the design. And this was a goal to make the building not only more usable, more functional, and accessible for the kind of community of today, but really also to reflect that idea. So if you could go to the next slide, we're going to look at and talk about the entrance. This is here a view on the right of what was the historic porte cochere, so where cars would traditionally drive through when the house was built in the 1850s. That was since no longer for vehicles, but people are kind of using the space to walk in, and there was a series of steps as you come into the building. So what we wanted to do is to transform the entrance so that it becomes really a single entrance for everybody, including for those who are disabled or who might want to move a little bit slower. So what we did was, and you see the plan highlight on the left, is we basically moved the existing steps forward from the left side of the porte cochere to the right, and created 2 ramps on either side, very gently sloping, using the same material that was previously in the driveway, this kind of brick paver, so that it looks like the ground is really just barely touched, but it's coming up now into the building with a very gentle slope, less than a typical ramp. So you can actually move up quite easily, and also adding new lighting and landscape, including these footrails that you see on the right. Next, please. So this is the detail now of the front door. And I want to just talk about a change that was really also related to the accessibility and inclusion piece, but maybe less than what you might traditionally think of. And this has to do with the kind of materiality and visibility of the front door. So on the left, you're looking at the before, which was the way that the door looked when we kind of got involved in the project, was very deep into the building, very large and very hard to operate wooden door. And one of the things that we realized by looking at historic documents, different plans, the house had 3 major renovations over the course of its history, was that the door was actually not in the original location. So what we decided to do was to push the door forward into the location of this kind of archway where it used to be originally. But it also, so it's out of the shadows, it's more visible, it's more inviting. So you can actually see it as you're approaching the building, which was really kind of related to the message that the building is telegraphing to those who are arriving. And to change it to a transparent steel and glass door that allows you to see what's going on, allows you to see what's on the other side and kind of invite you in. So on the image on the right, you see the new glass door, you see the steps that have moved out to the front and the ramps right beyond. Next, please. On the back of the building, this is a south patio. We also had some pretty significant restructuring of this terrace. And what we did was to actually rebuild the terrace higher to be at the same level as the interior, using the same material that was there before, a large format bluestone paver, and reworking the rail detail to keep our kind of respect and keep our distance from the historic rail, but allow this room to be, the kind of outdoor room to be used from the interior unobstructed for the first time. The other thing I want to mention for the slide is that related to this, and this more kind of look and feel of this space was just as important. And we used a mix of furniture that was part of the design as well, that was to represent diverse voices in the form of different designers that maybe you don't typically expect in a building like this. So we have, for instance, here in the far, the tables and chairs, and the rocking chairs were designed to kind of bring these kind of different diverse voices to the table. Next, please. These are 2 images looking of the inside, the entry, kind of atrium on the right, and the one of the meeting rooms or areas on the left. And the strategy of kind of dialogue between old and new continued on the inside. But as far as accessibility and inclusion was related, we wanted to think about flexibility on the one hand. So for instance, in the meeting rooms, we wanted to make sure that the furniture gives you options, give the users choice and agency, both in terms of seating, making ample seating throughout, both in the rooms itself, for instance, on the perimeter, offering benches, but also in the public spaces of the project. On the right, you see the kind of corner chair. We have a ton of seating which gives options to the users that might want to just pause on the way to another room. Related to this was also able to reconfigure the tables. So these are flip-top tables that can be easily moved inside and out. And really, lighting and acoustics were key as well. So we had a lot of new lighting that was introduced very kind of respectfully, but lighting is important because it gives options and it allows one to modulate the sensory experience of the space. So we wanted to create lots of layers of the lighting, and signage is just as important. So we use a program of new signage and wayfinding and also new artwork to kind of create a new coherence through the building. So on the right, you see the kind of bronze pedestal on the right. The far right is actually a new signage, digital signage that we introduced in the building to actually tell you where you are, to communicate where programming might be going on at the time, and kind of be something that can be really flexible, but really communicate as you walk in. Next. So our final image is in what's called the garden room. This is actually one of the more modern portions of the building. Was added in 1960, so already kind of a dialogue between old and new that was going on there. But I want to show this image because of something that extends with the kind of sensory interventions into the project, which has to do with acoustics. So what we did here is we lined the existing concrete coffers of this incredible ceiling with acoustical material so that it significantly improves the acoustics of the dining hall. And in fact, we've heard from users that it is actually significantly improved, but really, really with a very, very light touch. You can barely see it, but it actually is creating kind of an improvement in terms of the kind of sensory experience of the space. So lighting, acoustics, and wayfinding were kind of these three elements that went on top of what was required by code, and also in terms of how we thought of the sort of broader representation of the space. Thank you.
Ready for me?
Yours.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about a building called Museum Lab, and including universal design in existing or historic buildings may sound challenging, but it can be done if you have an open mind and the knowledge of how to implement universal strategies. I'm not going to go into all the details of the building, but I think it might be helpful to talk about sort of the history of the building and what we were dealing with when we first got it. And I think that it would be helpful for anybody who is given a project where it seems sort of undoable, but somehow you're able to bypass what's there and make it work. So I'm just going to give you a little background on a project called Museum Lab. In early 2017, the Children's Museum of Pittsburgh contacted me for help on a very ambitious 44,000 square foot expansion project that they were going to call Museum Lab. The project involved the renovation and adaptive reuse of the former Andrew Carnegie Free Library of Allegheny that was built in 1809. And that building sits adjacent to the Children's Museum of Pittsburgh. And they were looking to provide innovative spaces for kids aged 10 and over to play, learn, create through art, technology, and making. Just to give you a brief background of the building, in 2006, the granite clock tower was struck by lightning and it severely damaged the roof. So the library moved out, they relocated, and the building sat vacant for about 10 years. And through all those 10 years of neglect, it left the building in really, really poor condition. So sometime around 2015, the city handed the building over to the Children's Museum and they got to work. And I think that many architects and designers would normally be discouraged by the building's condition. And in all honesty, the first time I saw it, I was thinking, what the heck did I get myself into? But instead of being discouraged by the limitations of the existing building, everyone on the design team viewed it as an opportunity to preserve the historical integrity of the building by revitalizing the structure and incorporating many modern building concepts to reflect current user needs. And one of those concepts was universal design. So in the top photo, you can see what poor shape the building was in. This space was the former Carnegie Library reference room, and now it's called the Grable Gallery. And it has become the centerpiece of the building renovation, as well as a main junction for all visitors to the building. And I think the change to this room is probably the most dramatic, as you can see from the bottom slide and in the next photo that I'm going to show. One of the noteworthy UD strategies in this room is the flexibility and adaptability of open spaces. And what you're seeing here are photos of the room of the museum's main floor, which exemplifies both of those things. It's a large, flexible gathering space that can be adapted to accommodate all types of activities. So there's interactive play, there's exhibits, there's social events, and they've even hosted some wedding receptions. So the layout is constantly changing. And every time I go there, which is not very often, but every time I go like once a year, it's always different than the time before. Can you go to the next slide? Okay. So another great feature in this room is the ceiling. And after uncovering the tall ceiling of the original design, there was a major concern regarding acoustics. So an art installation was suspended from the ceiling to absorb sound and eliminate any reverberation. And this particular piece is a layered cut fabric structure. And it really goes well in the room because you really don't notice that it's got a purpose. It looks just like a piece of art. And the photo on the right is a space called the Make Lab. And it's a room that has a single purpose. And that's basically to make stuff, as the name would apply. The room is stocked with sewing machines, woodworking material, metal working equipment, 3D printers, laser cutters, and CNC routers. So there's a lot of activity and interaction in this room, and they provide all of the equipment, they provide all of the supplies, and it's really meant for kids 10 and over to sort of use their creativity to make things. If you go to the next slide. So lastly, here is a photo of a balcony in which was formerly the reading room, the library reading room. And the transformation of that room is really quite amazing. And right now that room is currently occupied by a charter school, which occupies a portion of the museum. And I think one of the things that I love about this museum is that we left a lot of the original brickwork and a lot of the original structure. And what we did is we combined a lot of innovative, modern features. So the signage, we have a very comprehensive signage system, and the signs sort of wrap around columns. We reused a lot of the materials, such as there were metal stacks that were used for the books way back in the 1800s, and we turned that into usable equipment. It actually is a huge it's a huge feature in the entryway. There's a welcome desk, and on the back of the welcome desk is that big stack, that big metal stack. And we used a lot of the existing materials as a way for wayfinding. So they basically alert people to orient themselves from where they are and then where they're going, because we certainly don't want people to not find their way. One of the frustrating things people always talk about is wayfinding. And if you're not familiar with a location and you can't find your way or make your way to the bathroom or find a way to get out, it's very uncomfortable, especially to people who are older or cognitively impaired. So we used a lot of the things that we could. We did adaptive reuse for a lot of the materials that we found there. So I recommend, if anybody has kids and they want to, and they happen to be in the Pittsburgh area, please visit this this museum, because it's really a really great work of art.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. We are going to move on to Giulietta.
Okay. So just a little bit more background about the Historic House Trust of New York City. We have 23 partner historic house museums that we help preserve, as I kind of mentioned earlier. But right now we have an immense capital program ongoing. We have 23 capital projects underway across 18 of our historic sites citywide. I'm really excited for this next step. Almost all of them have components of accessibility in them, because it's such a priority for the Parks Department and for the cultural institutions in New York City. But today, I really want to talk about the Dyckman Farmhouse Museum, because I think it's a really interesting kind of case study in how barriers emerge and how we can design, after those barriers already exist, to improve access to a site, a landscape, or a location. So the Dyckman Farmhouse Museum, if you've never been, it is a 1784 farmhouse, the oldest farmhouse still extant on the island of Manhattan. And it was built likely by enslaved labor to act as a farm. This was, thousands of acres at one point in what is now Upper Manhattan. And you can see right here that it is in a very urban environment. It's in an urban context. It's a heavily used park site. It's used not just as a historic site, but just for people to walk dogs and to go eat lunch and things like that right on Broadway at 204th Street. You can go to the next slide. So I briefly want to talk about how barriers sometimes come up and then how we design around them. So in the top left-hand square there, you can see a rendering of the Dyckman Farmhouse Museum in about 1866. And there is no berm, as we would say. The road, Kingsbridge Road, is on grade with the entrance to the historic house. But then you can see by the right-hand photo, that's in the late 1800s, early 1900s. I don't know the exact date, but the Victorian house in the background tells me probably 1890s. But you can see that as the subway was expanding to Upper Manhattan, there was major development, and as part of that development, Broadway was excavated about 20 feet down. The Dyckman Farmhouse Museum survived, or the Dyckman Farmhouse at the time survived that excavation, but as you can see, it became a very steep entrance to the house. And then as the development threatened the historic house, the last descendants of the Dyckman family to have grown up in the house repurchased the house and donated it to the city after restoring it. In their restoration, you can see in the bottom left-hand photo there, that's from 1916. You can already see them taking away that really steep entrance at the front of the historic house and building that wall that you'd see in the bottom right-hand photo. And the bottom right-hand photo is a photo from 1916 of the restored historic house. So the project that we are currently undertaking has a few goals, but one of the major ones is to create more access to the park and to the house without stairs. I think stairs is a major issue of this house because not only is it a historic house, but it has this really unique historical context and is raised 20 feet. So I think access to the grounds in the house, but also creating an accessible programming space that people can use and enjoy. To kind of Irina's point, it's not just about getting into the park, it's about really utilizing the programming that our historic house museum partners, the Dyckman Farmhouse Museum Alliance, offers to the community. And one of the ways that our team, along with John G. Wade Associates, who is the design consultant on this project, has come up with is on this kind of top right photo, you can see that there are two extensions on either side of the Dyckman Farmhouse Museum. One of them still exists after the restoration in 1916 that you can see in these photos at the bottom. But one of them that was built originally in 1830s, you can see that it's kind of called the north kind of wing extension, that was demolished in 1916. And so the solution that we kind of collectively came up with, again, with the museum being a huge proponent of this work, was to actually rebuild that historic addition that had been demolished and create an accessible entrance to the museum via that addition, which we found has been really helpful because we don't have to actually alter any historic fabric in order to make a large piece of this site accessible, but we also don't have to alter the historic look of the site to promote accessibility. So that's kind of an overview. This is a very in-depth design. I am not necessarily the design professional on the project, but if you have any specific design questions, I'm happy to kind of point you in that direction. But I think it's a really interesting case study of creative ways to look at accessibility from a physical perspective, and try to kind of incrementally improve these things, and then do a big improvement once you have the funds. So.
You would think I would be used to unmuting myself after 5 years, but no. Thanks to all three of you for giving us some really good examples of how you're including accessibility and universal design in your work. So one of the really big hurdles that we really seem to have with this design is really the design process and how you bring inclusivity to it. So where and how do you start integrating accessibility? I'm going to start with Denise.
Okay. So all the projects that I work on are mostly consulting projects. Even though I'm an architect, I'm not usually the architect of record. And typically what happens is organizations will reach out to me and they want to implement more inclusive or universal design strategies into their building. And we at our center, we have a certification program. It's based on LEED, but instead of dealing with sustainability, it deals with usability and consumer experience. So we have over 500 strategies. We actually call them solutions that you could implement into your project. And it follows a certification program, and you don't have to get certified, but we do recommend people use our 500 solutions. They're available online on a website. But for me personally, organizations will reach out, and a lot of times they don't reach out at the very beginning. They reach out when the design is already being done, or they reach out when it's in construction documents, or sometimes when construction is already started. And that's sort of too late most of the time for us to do it. But ideally, the client would come, they would tell us about their project. If they have documentation, or they have sketches, or they do have like an initial floor plan, they usually send me everything that they have, and I start looking through everything, and I provide them with feedback on what they can do to make it more inclusive, and what features we can include, and what technology that they can include. And I sort of guide them along the way through all the iterations. So, maybe it's a design development, maybe it's site design, maybe it's, it could be at any different stage, but the earlier you get us involved, the better that we could implement things into your project. And we're always cognizant of financial constraints and site constraints. And a lot of times the architects are dealing with clients who are not usually heavily involved in the design process. They're giving feedback, but they're not heavily, involved. So that's really how I typically do it. And I'm usually involved as long as I could be. And then before the project is completed, I do an in-person audit of the facility so that we make sure that nothing was lost in translation. And especially if they're getting certification for universal design, we want to make sure that they implemented all of the solutions that they promised they would, or that they were showing in the construction documents. So, but I know everybody does it a little differently. Because I specialize in accessibility and universal design, that's really all I do. We do a lot of research, but in terms of my focus, I do inclusive design and housing. I've done a lot of housing, and I've done a lot of home modifications. I've done over 1,600 modifications of houses, single family houses, and I've done group homes as well.
Fantastic. Irina, who should be engaged in this design process? Who's at the table?
Yeah, great question. I mean, I think to Denise's point, there's, a lot of different ways of doing it, and probably each project is different, and the setup allows for different configuration. But one of the things that I want to maybe mention that we do that's been really rich in our process is to engage with the disability and neurodivergence community as part of these initial audits. So audit is, Denise mentioned audit. It's something that we do at the beginning of every project. And the audits are usually accessibility audits. And sometimes we even work with a consultant to help us with, depending on the complexity of the project. But also what we call sensory audits. So those audits are actually walking through with the building users, the stakeholders, people who are actually using the building day to day, or disabled or neurodivergent self-advocates. We have kind of a consultant group of our own who we kind of bring in. Just want to understand how the space is and is not working from a sensory perspective. And these are things that we're not always in a position to understand or to see. So these sensory audits are really important because they kind of give us these different glimpses into what might be an existing conditions assessment. And then we codify this audit into annotated plans that go beyond the kind of typical accessibility annotations, because we also kind of try to record the senses. So this, for instance, smell might not think like it's part of the accessibility and inclusion, but it is, because some people get really bothered by, let's say, kitchen smells that might come in from the adjacent commercial kitchen. Or of course, sound is huge. So try to codify physical mobility issues, but also other sensory issues that might be key in the understanding of a space. And we think it's really important to walk through with disabled users, walk through with neurodivergent users. They give a perspective that you cannot always have, and it's super enriching and really valuable. And it kind of changes, I think, the focus from disability as something that has to be accommodated at the kind of the end of the design to something where we can start with, and it's really part of the process. So I think that's kind of a fundamental shift that I think has to happen. And I think to Denise's point, like, it has to be at the beginning. It's not like in CDs, although in some projects it has to be, but if you can help it early.
I actually want to piggyback off of that for a second and also address a question that I saw in the comments. I realized I didn't answer this about the Dyckman Farmhouse Museum. So one of the kind of jumping off points for this project was a very steep set of stairs that is the current entrance to the park at Broadway and 204th Street, right at the corner. And that set of stairs is so inaccessible just for everybody. I mean, it is just a horrible set of stairs. It's dangerous, it's hard, it's too narrow for groups of people when you have a program. It's a terrible set of stairs. So from that kind of conversation, this project and this restoration and this reconstruction and accessibility improvements that we're discussing kind of ballooned. And so we could not have had this project without a discussion about accessibility and inclusive design. And, what we came up with after many years of advocacy, our museum partners are really keyed into the community and with elected officials who have helped fund this project. We found that it's just taken on a life of its own, which is amazing. And we have so much support. We're creating a new park entrance on 204th Street. You can't really see from these photos, but there's actually kind of a hill up. So it's kind of a safer grade to create a new barrier-free entrance to the park, which I think will just be a benefit to everybody and everyone who wants to use the park. But seriously and truly, it's a collaborative process. There are so many people who care about this site, and we just want to include them as much as possible in the process. And we really rely on our museum partners and community partners to do that.
And is there at any point, how is failure to get through this impacting accessibility?
I'm sorry, can you say that again? My thing buzzed.
Not a problem. How is failure of that design process really coming in for you?
It's taking a really long time. I think one of the major challenges that we have, look, this was a restoration that happened in 1916. It's 2025. It's been a long time coming. And I think every month that we continue to design to make sure that it's right, and every month that we have to advocate for additional funding is, painful for the community. And I think that's the biggest hurdle, is making sure it's done both correctly and as expeditiously as possible.
Speaking of money, is cost a prohibitive factor of universal design, Denise?
It doesn't have to be. I want to go back before I move on to that. I just want to follow up on something Irina said. She was talking about how you get the disability community involved when you're designing a building, and we do that as well. And I think that's a really great thing. But one thing that people have talked to me about is some architects or some designers, they'll sort of simulate what a disabled person would experience. So maybe they'll bring a wheelchair to the site and try and move around, and you can never mimic what a disabled person goes through. And the disability community really frowns upon that, because someone who is completely able-bodied cannot ever simulate what a person with a disability will experience, or like cognitively, physically. So it's really frowned upon. So I want to, if there's any architects on this webinar, I want to make sure that they're not doing that, because it hurts the project. Let's go back to cost. I'm sorry. Regarding cost, it doesn't necessarily have to cost a lot more. I know that there's a stigma attached to doing anything that seems specialized, such as wider doors, although 36-inch wide doors are becoming standard these days. And a lot of the construction industry is recognizing that. And a lot of these products you can get on the shelf. You can go to Home Depot and Lowe's, and a lot of these products are available. So there are definite times where it's going to cost more, but if you have to put a staircase in and you can put a ramp in or a landscape grade in where it will satisfy more people, it doesn't necessarily have to cost more, because you're substituting one for the other. If you use innovative technology, of course, that's going to cost more, but not everything has to be related to cost. And I know cost is always feared by whoever's paying for the project, the developers. And I know that architects sometimes have difficulty making it innovative or making it fully inclusive with the budget that they've been given. But you try your best and you try and do whatever you can. So, I mean, Irina, you work on very different projects than I do, kinds of projects that I do. So you may have a different opinion.
I mean, it really varies. I think it doesn't have to cost more. And I think part of the way to address that is to often think about what else you're getting out of this move, for instance, right? So you're getting a ramp that might enable but it can also create a host of conditions that might also be helpful. So not thinking about it as, just a kind of finite solution, but understanding the kind of repercussions of a certain move. So it's not, a cost like one-to-one. So I think it's really helpful to put it in the larger context of the project, of the design, of the site, and so on.
Yeah, I kind of also want to add on to this about the cost, and also address a question, the comment about accessibility audits. So we also embarked on an accessibility audit process, and we have transition plans for all 23 of our partner historic house museums. And we've actually found that there are a lot of interventions that you can do that are low budget. And of course, these large capital projects can make a lot of changes really quickly and can really redesign an entire space and are very important. But I mean, even just kind of reformatting a bathroom, adding a handrail, and knowing where those things go, and empowering yourself to make those smaller changes to kind of, I hate to say, like, hold you over until you can get the money to do a larger intervention has been really successful for us. And then also just kind of investing in some programmatic changes to, adding, virtual elements, adding tactile tours, adding things that, again, don't cost a lot of money, but maybe cost expertise and investment. But we've felt that it's just helping the entire kind of collection of houses become more well known as being accessible, which is really important for us. So regardless, I mean, it is hard to raise money for large capital projects, but there's also a lot you can do without that fundraising.
Fundraising is always going to end up being key, no matter how hard we try. So in looking forward and looking at our time, what is next for the field of accessibility in architecture? I'm going to give you each 1 minute before we drop off to questions. So starting with Danise.
Okay. Well, at the Idea Center, we see universal design as an evolutionary process rather than just an end state. Because unlike accessibility, there's really no level of compliance we need to conform with for universal design. So we're always looking for ways to create a better world for everybody by providing more inclusive environments. And I always say that you can talk to people about what universal design is, and nobody will ever say that it's a bad thing. But letting people experience it firsthand makes people really understand it and see the benefits. And although I'm working on some really high profile projects right now, it's great and all, looks great for my, my CV and all that. But the greatest satisfaction that I get is that people will go to these places, and the more people can experience universal design firsthand, the more they'll advocate for buildings to be more inclusive. And that's really the goal.
Excellent. Irina.
I'm going to make this brief because I want to make sure we have time to answer some of the questions that are in the chat. But I think, in the context of this conversation, how do we find a way to make historic buildings and historic landscapes more accessible and more usable and more enjoyable by more people? And I think that takes kind of conversations, takes a lot of work, takes a lot of engagement and investment. And I think this is something that needs to be seen as part of our practice, not just something that happens every so often and not something that is kind of optional. So more of this.
And Giulietta.
Yeah, very much the same. I'll be very quick, but we did a kind of a discovery project to kind of talk to all of our museum partners and kind of determine the state of our partners and their capacity to address accessibility improvements. And I think where I would really like to see the field go in the future is, no fear, really, just feeling really empowered and confident and feeling excited about including accessibility and inclusive design into your work, and it just being like just part of it, just integrated. It's just the work that you do. That's really where I would love for us to get to, and I know my co-panelists feel the same. We've talked about this at length.
Absolutely. Well, we have a perfectly willing community of people here to help forward accessibility. So starting with questions. Could any of you speak to the challenges of having access solutions comply with oversight and approval that comes with a Historic or Landmark Commission, thinking the LPC?
Yeah. I'll start very quickly. Yes, I think we brought LPC in very early. We got community board support and involvement very early, and would not have gone forward with a design that they did not approve of. So just the earlier the better, the more collaborative the better, and again, making sure the community is involved as well, because those letters of support are important.
I want to just add to that. I think maybe one of the things that's been our experience is that thinking of historic buildings not necessarily as sort of static, but actually looking at these like modifications over time, and that sometimes going into archives or going into different looking at plans from before. And I think you kind of start to find suggestions of what's original, what's not original, what are areas where you might have more leeway to create a modification. So I think kind of looking really closely, and sometimes there are opportunities that say, well, this actually was changed 3 times, so therefore, and then you can make a case when you're presenting to LPC that actually there is this sort of transformation. So kind of thinking of them in that way, I think has helped. And we've had luck in kind of finding these sort of openings into a transformation. And I think really kind of understanding that any building, like any city, has a certain amount of dialogue between old and new, and we have to kind of make that case to the, authorities having jurisdictions.
All right. Julie asks, my company is particularly concerned about having an accessibility assessment in fear that once we know, we will have to commit to the upgrades. How do you address this?
We get hired to do accessibility audits all the time. We've done whole campuses, we've done work for the government, we've done large organizations, and you can hire somebody to do an accessibility audit, and they'll provide you with a report showing every single thing that is non-compliant. And then, what you do with it sort of is your own. I mean, we would hope that the result of that would be modifications would be done to make sure that your facility is fully accessible. Unless somebody brings a lawsuit up against you, no one's gonna be, I guess, the police are not going to come and say, hey, you have to make this accessible. But I would think that anybody that wants an accessibility audit is doing it because they want to improve their facility and make it easier for people to interact with their environment, with the environment. I would hope it's not done just out of fear of being sued.
I mean, I also want to add that I think that with any of the accessibility assessments, there's priorities that come out of that you can rank. So there's things that you must do, and once you can, I mean, it's related to the level of investment, how much money you're spending on it, and different. So there's usually a hierarchy that emerges. So you can maybe improve a few things and then come back and improve more. There's kind of incremental idea that I think comes out of these assessments. So I think you don't have to commit to all the upgrades. You can commit to some of the upgrades depending on funding and kind of show what that is. So I think it's a great start to do an accessibility assessment. So
yeah, I totally agree. You don't know what you don't know. And it's definitely not as scary as it seems. You know, there are very small things that you can improve, kind of like Irina said, and it's a nice start.
A lot of times we do an accessibility and universal design we do it at the same time, an audit. So there'll be two of us, and we'll be traveling together and walking through the facility together. One of us is looking for ADA issues, and one of us is looking how we can improve the environment implementing universal design strategies. So, and then we provide that report, and you get a taste of both. And you know, some of them may, once you make it more accessible, it may sort of take over for the solution that we talked about that would be inclusive. It's sort of the same thing sometimes. There's no negative to doing it. There's no negative into knowing where your shortfalls are in an environment.
All right, and looking at our last question, it is conveniently about, landscapes and landmarks. And we all know that most landscapes, especially the more naturalistic ones, are not made to be accessible. That's not what they were thinking about 100 years ago. How do you mediate that desire between making these scenic landmarks accessible and maintaining historic design integrity? Throw it to Giulietta.
Oh no. It's actually really funny. So we are a public-private partnership with the Parks Department, and my background's in, buildings and historic preservation. And I'm actually like, this is something that I would want to improve my knowledge on, but it's really difficult. And I think not to cast the net too large, but when you're talking about landscape, you're talking about climate change, you're talking about permeable surfaces, you're talking about, native plants and what's retaining water and things like that. So it's actually a really, really complex conversation that can go on for a really long time. It can absolutely be its own project. And I don't know that I have the code to crack, or I haven't cracked the code. But it's definitely something that we work on every day with our historic sites that are sometimes in more naturalistic landscapes and then sometimes in more programmed landscapes.
There's something called equal facilitation, and a lot of times we try and do that. If someone can't experience things the way everybody else does, there's other ways to give them sort of that ability to enjoy what everyone else is enjoying by, I don't want to say going above and beyond, but basically going above and beyond and coming up with a solution that will work for everybody.
Maybe I just want to add to that. I think to what Denise just said, also to Giulietta's point, I think sometimes it's not just about the visual, like it's not about the way something looks. So kind of thinking about the way something might work and how it might perform and how it might be related to, water drainage and these other events. Like you might actually find a case for modifying something that is in a way kind of working. It's not, not just the kind of form of it, but kind of layered into that is another solution that might also be more accessible. So kind of looking for, I think the wider net is actually the solution.
And on the ADA, that's called reasonable accommodations.
I will also mention that in this Dykeman Farmhouse Museum project, a feature of it that I didn't even mention is there's this little Hessian hut in the backyard that is also only accessible via stairs at the moment, and we are remedying that. But very much kind of like looking holistically, not just as the historic house as a resource, but the whole site as a resource is really helpful, which, may or may not help you with this question, but is kind of important to think about when designing for these projects.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for both an informative panel and a great discussion and great questions. If you have any more questions, here is everyone's contact information. Please reach out. We really appreciate your time, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.